Welcome to CBS Reporters Roundtable. I'm John Dickerson. President Obama announced his support for same-sex marriage this week, marking an important civil rights milestone. But how important was it politically? The same question can be asked about revelations concerning Mitt Romney's high school days. One political outcome we can be certain of: Senator Richard Lugar will not be returning to Washington as an elected official next year. To discuss all of this, I'm joined today by Shira Toeplitz and of Roll Call, Aaron Blake of The Washington Post, and Josh Kraushaar of Hotline. Let's start with you, Josh. The same-sex marriage decision. I think we know by now the president maybe was going to make this on his own before the election, but Joe Biden forced him to do it. Now that the dust has cleared a little bit, let's figure out what we can say is for sure at the end of this. So just jump in somewhere on that.
Yeah, well, John, we know this is a very risky decision for the White House. The president is a very risk-averse politician. I think we've seen over the past 3 years, they don't like to get too much out in front of some big issues. This is a very, very big issue. People have a lot of passion about gay marriage. And when you look at the political impact of it, I think in the end it's a wash, but it's a very volatile wash because you have parts of the coalition, the Obama coalition, young voters, college-educated voters. They agree with him. They were looking for him to come out a while ago when it came to gay marriage. But you also have Rust Belt voters, these undecided voters that the Obama team is convinced they can peel away from Mitt Romney. And these are the types of voters that prevented them from coming out in favor of gay marriage. They're worried that this could be an issue that pushes some of these voters to Mitt Romney's camp.
Sure, you just spent a lot of time in Indiana.
Yes.
Covering the Lugar race. What's your sense of how Indiana's gone from the president's probably his battleground map, but the Midwestern sensibility?
Right.
What's your sense of how this lands in those voters?
Well, I think the economy is still the number one issue. I was in Indiana. I was also in Pennsylvania and southwestern Pennsylvania, which is really kind of the heart of where a lot of these voters, the president and Mitt Romney, are going to fight for over the next 6 months or so. And I think a lot of these voters really don't give a hoot about gay marriage right now. They really just care about the economy over and over again. So in many ways, Josh called this a risky decision. I'm not quite sure how risky it was, because anyone who is so against gay marriage that it would change their mind on the president, I don't think they would have voted for him anyway. And I think the people that the presidential candidates really fight over, the suburban, frankly, white women, they don't care about gay marriage right now. This is not their number one issue. They're worried about getting their kids to carpool, picking their kids up from school, the economy, and they pay attention the last 2 weeks of an election. And this is so far from that right now.
There was an interesting quote at the end of Jeff Zelony's piece in the Times today of a Republican voter at a Romney event saying, I don't care about this, and plus, I don't know what my grandchildren will be, which I thought was an interesting way to think about this issue. Aaron, where do you come down on this, and do you talk a little bit about Romney's position? He's obviously against same-sex marriage. He reiterated that position, but then seems to have moved on. What do you think he'll actually do?
I think it's remarkable because just 8 years ago we were talking about a presidential election where President Bush, and some people agree or disagree with this, but President Bush was supposed to have won that race based on the votes of values voters, so-called values voters. Now, of course, the economy wasn't as big of an issue back then. It was more of a foreign policy time, but even then, the Iraq War was not front of mind. There wasn't as much clouding the issue matrix. I think that Romney's response to this has been very interesting. He basically said, this is my position. Let's talk about something else now. And I think that that's probably a smart strategy because this isn't something that's so clearly in Republicans' favor right now that it's a no-brainer. And a guy like Romney doesn't need to spend time relitigating something that the Republican Party may not be on the right side of in 2 years' time, in 4 years' time, something that could come back to bite them in the future.
So it seems like Romney's not going to be talking about it very much. And the president, the reason this was a bit of a mix-up, not only did they not want it to look like Joe Biden was leading on this issue and not the president, but this was supposed to be roll out the campaign week for the president, right?
And I thought it was fascinating that Joe Biden, who is essentially the unofficial emissary to the blue-collar, working-class parts of the country, he's the guy that comes out in favor of it and in a very open way, where it's President Obama whose base is much more comfortable with gay marriage. He's the one who's kind of leading from behind, if you will, on this issue. And I think that's fascinating to read the coverage today, where Obama Vice President Biden came to apologize to President Obama for being out in front of this. I think there's some real embarrassment that it was Biden who is not the guy you would think would be out in front on this issue. He's the one leading, and Obama seems to be being dragged along.
Isn't it all a little too well orchestrated? Isn't the timing just a little too questionable? I mean, it just worked out so well. The Republican primaries died down. They could really use this week to seize on that issue. I'm not accusing the White House of misrepresenting, but I think it's very convenient that Joe Biden said this, and this rollout came out right before Obama goes to Hollywood and raises $15 million in the most gay-friendly community in the country.
True, although there was real panic when Biden said this, in part because the president was launching his campaign on Saturday and setting up those careful themes. $25 million worth of ads on Monday, not talking about gay marriage or same-sex marriage, and then they have to deal with this.
The thing that we have to remember too is that Obama's been raising money from the gay community for a long time too. This wasn't the first time that he's done that. I think I saw a story where 1 of 6 of his major bundlers.
I don't know how they figured that out, but
1 in 6 of his major campaign bundlers come from the gay and lesbian community, which I think is a remarkable commentary on what that community means to politics today. The other thing that I think is interesting here is the ongoing relationship between Biden and the president. The president went on TV, went on Good Morning America, and basically said Biden went over his skis a little bit, which I thought was an interesting phrase for that. But we've seen these kind of clips over the years where Biden does something, and here's Obama over here. He kind of rolls his eyes a little bit. So you almost wonder whether these guys are always on the same page, and maybe we're giving into our desire for some kind of a clash between the president and the vice president. But I think it's interesting to watch them work together.
Well, that's right. Well, and as Josh mentioned, the eastern part of Ohio, western part of Pennsylvania, where Biden is, you talk to strategists on the ground of the Democratic Party, they rely on Biden to talk to that group of voters, and so that's why David Axelrod says sort of, your blessings are also your curses, which is that Biden effusiveness, whatever it is, the mix of his heart that appeals to folks that are kind of blue-collar workers is also the thing that tumbles over and gets him out of
The other thing that I think is interesting here is that Biden, when he was picked as the vice president, and even before that, his reputation was he's a gaffe machine. The thought was, this is a risky pick. He's going to do something stupid. He's going to embarrass the campaign. He really hasn't done anything to knock the campaign off its message in the 4 years since then, until, arguably, depending on how you think this all unfolded, until this episode over the weekend.
Right.
I think one of the most telling nuggets came in today's New York Times when an anonymous senior Obama campaign official made the case that Biden had actually been arguing against coming out for gay marriage in private White House meetings. That he's not. This was just this random. I mean, this really was a gaffe. He was just kind of improvising on the spot, which puts Biden in a very bad light. And to me, it suggests that there is this real tension between Obama and Biden, despite what the public appearances of we're get along great, they're the best buddies, and we knew they weren't particularly close from the get-go, and it was kind of a marriage of convenience in 2008. And I think if Biden continues to be making these inopportune gaffes and ticks off the president's top campaign staff, we could actually be seeing, we might even be hearing speculation about a change at the number 2 spot.
I think Mark Leibovich had an excellent story in the New York Times, right? I think it was Tuesday morning, really going through the Obama-Biden relationship. And he opened with this really great anecdote about how originally in the president's White House Correspondents' Dinner speech, he was supposed to make some joke about dropping Joe Biden from the ticket, and then the president crossed it out. He didn't even want to go there because he was just afraid it would add fuel or any kind of speculation to the fire.
On the other hand, that would have been a great way to make us all stop talking about it. If the president's up there joking about it, then obviously it's not going to happen, right?
Right. I know there's a lot of cross currents with the Biden thing. What's planned, what's not, what's a true message, because the president's thrown a couple of those brushback pitches before with comedy, kind of saying, settle down, Joe. All right, let's
crazy Uncle Joe.
That's right. Let's switch now to the other piece of surprising news this week, which was the Washington Post story about Mitt Romney's time in prep school in Michigan, in which he does not come out very favorably. There is this one important anecdote about where he rounded up a group of boys and set upon a classmate whose hair he didn't like, was too long. The Post suggests that he was at some level known or not known as potentially being gay. Romney, while the other kids held him down, cut his hair according to this incredibly detailed piece. what do you make of it? Does it matter? What does it tell us? What does it tell us in the context of this campaign?
Well, clearly it's a bad story for the Romney campaign, and it underscores this narrative that the Obama campaign is trying to present, that Romney's out of touch, he's back, he's from the 50s, he's kind of this Leave It to Beaver type of character who just doesn't understand if the Obama campaign slogan is forward, he's looking backwards. But I do think, like, if we look back at what we were doing in high school and can extrapolate that at all to what we are at this point today, I don't think many people looking at that story and looking at what happens, I mean, they'll look at it for some interesting anecdotes, but I ultimately don't think people are going to look at what he did in high school 50 years ago and say this has much to do with how he would govern as a president.
Right, and also it doesn't seem like there's a I mean, part of what was interesting about this story for a lot of people is it seemed so surprising. I mean, he was a guy of hijinks and all of that, but this is, he's the bully in this case. I mean, he's not just a cut-up, he's cutting up the guy's hair.
Right, the story presents him as the ringleader, basically, in this whole plot to cut the guy's blonde hair, which was hanging in his face or something like that. I do agree with Josh that generally this is not a good story for the Romney campaign, but I don't think many voters are going to use this when they go to the polls next November. I do think it's, for the most part, respectable journalism to put that kind of stuff out there. Goodness knows people have gone much deeper into the president's past, surfacing photos and all kinds of things during the 2008 campaign.
Right, and Aaron, what do you make of, I mean, part of the problem for Romney here also is that he's undefined in some senses, and although we know him, but in terms of a general election context, he's trying to improve his story. He's got very low favorable numbers, and this does come at a time where he'd rather be telling his warm stories about the 1950s and not have this one in there.
And I think one of the major impacts that lengthy Republican primary has had is that the Obama campaign, even before they started voting, had been kind of defining Romney as the rich guy, the out-of-touch guy, the guy who doesn't know what you think or how you feel. And I think that this story feeds into that a little bit. And it's, if nothing else, even if people aren't necessarily going to look at this and say, oh, Romney's a bad guy for something he did 30, 40 years ago, they may look at it and say, this is a guy who, or rather, this is somebody who I don't know anything about, but this is the one thing that I do know about him, and he hasn't had a chance really to come forward and define himself for that general election.
I think the bigger problem for Romney is how his campaign and how he in particular responds to these types of stories. You saw him just the other day in Colorado when he was asked about marijuana. And usually it's a question that a good presidential candidate can brush off and joke about. I know he wants to talk about the economy, but he's got to know he's going to get other questions. And the fact that he can't brush off these kind of stories that aren't particularly favorable, he can't automatically refocus himself without looking irritated. That Bret Baier interview I can't forget from the primary campaign.
Right.
It was a friendly interview, and he just got really, really upset when he was scrutinized on some basic questions. So I think it's a real test for Romney and his campaign to show him that he's above a lot of these small nitpicky things and can focus on the economy.
I mean, suffice to say, Romney is not translated to a general election candidate very smoothly. I mean, the guy's basically been running in a Republican primary for president since 2004 in many ways, and he just has not made that transition to be able to speak to independent voters. But there's still a lot of time. This is pretty early out on the campaign trail. I think what will be interesting is to see what kind of arsenal the Obama campaign has come up with him in terms of opposition research, because his opponents in the primary did not have the staff or the organization to really research his background and get a lot of oppo out on Romney.
Well, it's a good point. This week, Governor Romney, in an interview the day before he went to Michigan, when he was in Ohio, said about the car bailout that he took a lot of credit for it. Now, we can remember that Governor Romney was against the bailout at first. He was for bankruptcy, which the car companies ultimately went through. The administration says, though, that they never would have been able to get to the bankruptcy had there not been the bailout, because they would have collapsed beforehand and imploded, and so would the whole car industry. Aaron, a lot of credit for the car. I mean, he can claim credit for writing an op-ed, but that seemed to be also just kind of off the beam.
I tend to think with this stuff, and I'm not going to, I think our fact checker at the Washington Post judged his statement about this and said that it gave it 3 Pinocchios, which is a pretty high rating for it not being true. I think, though, that he has enough of a relationship to this issue, and he was out front on the bankruptcy stuff, enough to the point where he can kind of obfuscate this issue, which could potentially be harmful to him in a state like Michigan or in the Midwest. And so I think that as long as he can kind of make that case to people and have a somewhat believable case to be made, then I think maybe he can not pay that price that he otherwise might have after, in the Michigan primary we're talking about him being against the bailout.
Do we think we're going to be talking about this bailout for the next 6 months? Because while he was having to talk about it in Ohio and then kind of not talk about it in Michigan, the president's ads, the 25 million ads he runs, the exhibit A of his economic program is that the car industry's back, and then after it says the car industry's back, it says the president believed in us, he trusted us, sort of this argument to the middle class that he's got your back. It feels like we're just going to be going back and forth over this issue for the next 6 months.
Yeah, I think it'll be an indicative topic. I think we'll talk about it a lot. I think we'll talk about it more than the haircut Mitt Romney gave one of his classmates in high school or middle school. I think it's an important issue. We should talk about it. What I look up going down the road is which states this matters in. And it matters in Ohio, it matters a little bit in Indiana, it matters in Michigan, these Rust Belt states. So let's assume Republicans, let's just, for the sake of argument, are going to take Indiana, and then Ohio is the battleground state. At what point does Romney just completely divorce himself from Michigan and say, I'm not going to win there, and just not even try to play that at all?
Because they pretend, in much the way the Obama campaign says that Arizona's on the map, they say Michigan's on the map in the Romney campaign.
And they believe it. And one thing that really I find remarkable about the auto bailout issue, if you talk to Democratic pollsters, and many who did races in that part of the country in 2010, it was actually a very winning issue for Republicans.
Yeah.
And there was an ABC News Washington Post poll just out today that actually shows the country's pretty divided on the auto bailout, especially among independents. So it's a winning issue for the president, but I'm surprised Romney is so defensive about it. I'm surprised he doesn't use it to pivot to other issues, raise questions about government spending and bailouts and so on, because the auto bailout in and of itself is mildly popular. It's a winning issue for Obama, but the overall theme of overspending and bailouts in general is a winning issue for Romney. So I'm surprised he comes out so defensively on this issue specifically.
And also in Ohio, where the Democrats think the car bailout's going to help people kind of attach their improving economy to the president, there was that Quinnipiac poll this week where they asked people who's responsible for the good economy in Ohio. 68% said the governor, who's got a really 38% approval rating.
Yeah.
Terrible approval rating. They give him the credit, not the president. Let's switch now to Indiana, where you've been, making your home, and Lugar's loss.
Right.
What should we make of the departure of Dick Lugar, and what does his Senate loss say about where politics are right now?
Well, I think a lot of people have tried to make sense of this week, and a lot of people, I think, incorrectly tried to paint this as a Tea Party challenge to the right. I think this, in many ways, was Senator Lugar's own fault that he ended up in this position, and I think it's for a couple reasons. Number one, definitely the residency issue. He sold his home in Indiana but kept his residency for his voter registration at that home, and he sold it in the 70s. That does not play well with voters, okay? That says, I've moved to Washington, I'm no longer a Hoosier. So I think once that really hit, once that issue blew up in mid-March, I know for a fact his poll numbers just sank. They went into free fall. So that was a personal issue that Lugar had to deal with. And also the way he ran his campaign. I think there was a way to confront Murdoch early on, especially because he was a very weak candidate for 3/4, almost all of 2011. He got in the race in mid-February. He didn't raise very much money through all of 2011. Dick Lugar could have gone in with a financial arsenal and just annihilated him politically early on, and he did not do that.
I think that this race has often been compared to Lugar's colleague who was elected in 1976 alongside him. Orrin Hatch was supposed to have his own primary trouble this year. He got out early. He was really aggressive. The process there is heavily reliant on the convention. So his campaign was recruiting delegates to go to that convention and vote for him. Obviously, his Utah colleague lost 2 years before. The other race that I compare this to is the McCain primary in 2010 when he faced a former Congressman, J.D. Hayworth. And the McCain campaign was scorched earth from day one.
Right.
Really got after him, raised and spent a ton of money, including some that was left over from the presidential campaign, and just ended it.
That's a great point.
Well, here's my one problem with that analogy. McCain has something like $30 million to spend annihilating J.D. Hayworth. And J.D. Hayworth, although a former congressman, definitely was not a great candidate. I would say Richard Murdoch on the candidate scale. Remember that infomercial J.D. Hayworth did? Remember him sitting there on the couch, free government money or whatever he said. That is terrible with Republican primary voters. Richard Murdoch, maybe he had stuff like that in his past. We don't know, because Dick Lugar did not run a strong enough campaign to dig it up and push it out. But I think Richard Murdoch on the whole is a much better candidate than J.D. Hayworth.
I just wanted to quickly put a dissenting note. I think the Tea Party had a big role in Lugar's defeat. And if you look at the polling, way before even Murdoch got in the race, Lugar was in deep trouble going back to 2011. And I think a lot of it, people think of the Tea Party as very ideological, but they also look at generational factors. We talked about how Lugar's been around for a long, long time. Anyone who's been in Washington for over 30 years, that's a big, big warning sign for senators, for members of the House. Tea Party activists and conservatives, they want to change. Marco Rubio is a representative of that movement because he's a generational change. He's as much a symbol of generational change as he is of this ideological hard edginess. So I think Murdoch, he's not a spring chicken, but he symbolizes the fact that he's younger and he represents some of the issues that the younger generation of conservatives stand for.
What's interesting, though, about him, and that's separate and different, it seems to me, from Marco Rubio, is that Murdoch's coming to Washington basically saying, I'm going to be a polarizer. Or I'm going to be kind of more in the obstructionist camp. And Marco Rubio is now trying to find common ground on immigration. He's not making as much of the kind of, I'm going to come to Washington and stop the horrible machine in the way it sounded like Murdoch was saying.
Right, but if you look at the demographics of the two states they represent, it's safe to say Indiana is certainly in the right red column and is probably getting a deeper red as time goes on. Florida is in the purplish column, and if anyway, because of the large Hispanic growth, which is why Marco Rubio, one of the reasons I can assume why Marco Rubio was working so hard on immigration, is moving in many ways overall more purple than red.
And I wouldn't be surprised, just like Rubio when he came to Washington became a little more of a compromiser, I wouldn't be surprised if Murdoch does get elected. He'll have friends, he'll need to work across the aisle. There are certain institutional imperatives that force you to work along the other side of the aisle.
All right, we're going to end the main portion of the show there. Let's go now to endorsements. Aaron, you're one thing that people should check into this week.
Well, we're talking about Marco Rubio. I think that everybody has at least one of their two eyes on the Veep stakes right now, the so-called Veep stakes. I thought there was an interesting, I believe it was a Hotline poll of insiders in Washington, and overwhelmingly they thought that Rob Portman was going to be Mitt Romney's vice presidential pick, or maybe thought that he should be. I would suggest that people go to BuzzFeed.com and look at the story, 15 interesting things that you didn't know about Rob Portman. One, he does a really good impression of a chicken. And
which was big in Lyndon Johnson's selection, if I can remember correctly, from 1960.
And two, he once snuck a kayak into China, which I think is a significant undertaking.
And 15 interesting things about Rob Portman, because Rob Portman is a kind of a plain guy.
Because he makes Tim Pawlenty look exciting.
Right.
Wow. I didn't know Rob Portman had that in him, the kayak. I didn't know he had it in him.
Neither did I.
And what's your endorsement?
All right. I think, along with the story in the Washington Post by Jason Horowitz about Mitt Romney's escapades, shall we call them, in Michigan in high school, there was a really great photo gallery, including some Mitt Romney yearbook photos that I thought were great. So just goes to show you that everyone was awkward in middle school. You can look like Mitt Romney now, but everyone was awkward then.
He looked a lot like the character Stifler from American Pie
Yes.
when he was in high school.
Yes,
I don't think we should forget that.
Yes.
You know, the one other, going back to this topic just quickly, a point one of my colleagues made that I thought made good sense is that when they talk about Mitt Romney being a kind of a prankster in high school, this may take that off the table in terms of what they could do to lighten up his image. When you think of prankster, that which means for Romney, who doesn't talk about his faith very much because of worries they have about him being Mormon, whose discussion of his business career is somewhat tricky because of that. It just cordons off another area of his past that may be harder for him to talk about.
Yeah.
I've got an apolitical plug tonight at the AFI Silver Spring, the 48-hour film festival. It's a remarkable display of movie-making talent, and you have to act, write, produce in 2 days, nonstop. And my good friend Chad Horn has a movie coming out 9:30 tonight called A Guy Walks Into a Bar, a fantasy story about a wannabe stand-up comedian. So it's amazing. I don't know how you can make a movie in a week, no less 48 hours, and it's a remarkable display of movie-making talent.
Oh my God, that's great. Do they have little beds for them to collapse on when they're done?
They are they're running on caffeine and adrenaline pretty much throughout the whole
5-hour
process.
energy drink. Yeah. I would like to endorse some wonderful photographs of the 1960 Democratic Convention taken by Gary Winogrand. They were discovered about a year ago, and they tell the story of that famous nomination of John Kennedy, but the pictures aren't just of the famous faces. They also capture the moment and the people you've never heard of and probably never will. They're just great. Check them out on the New York Times website. They were in the New York Times Magazine a couple of weeks ago. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Join us here every Friday at 12:30 on CBSNews.com. For everyone here at Hot Sheet Live, I'm John Dickerson. Have a great weekend.